people have a tendency to copy other people and things. Person sees someone that they see as successful, and what do? They try to copy them. They'll even go so far as to try and copy their looks sometimes. Businesses will copy the business models of their successful competitors. Even when you deal with architecture, you will have buildings that are built to look like other buildings. There's a building actually here in downtown Fort Worth that is a replica. It's a copy of a very famous building in New York City. And then, of course, in Las Vegas, there's one of the casinos has literally the whole front copying all sorts of images from all over the world, and you can go there and see the Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty, all these other sites, and they're just all right there at the front of the casino. But there are heavenly things and heavenly structures that are actually copied here on earth as well. And we'll start to talk about that a little bit. It's going to come into play as we progress through. Jesus is the perfect priest. He is, as the writer of Hebrews said, he is the priest that we need. The Old Testament law, it established these animal sacrifices that were incapable of solving the sin problems. The Levitical priests, they had to offer sacrifices over and over and over again for themselves and for other people. Every day they had to do this. Jesus, we are told, offered himself one time as the sacrifice, and he is perfect, unlike the earthly priests. In fact, the writer of Hebrews said that they were weak. And it wasn't meant as an insult per se, but just a reality that they were incapable of actually resolving any of the spiritual problems that actually exist within the people. Now, as we come into chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, he says, "Now the main point of what is being said is this. We have this kind of high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and the true tabernacle that was set up by the Lord and not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices, therefore it was necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he wouldn't be a priest, since there are those offering the gifts prescribed by the law. These serve as a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was warned when he was about to complete the tabernacle. For God said, 'Be careful that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain.' But Jesus has now obtained a superior ministry, and to that degree he is the mediator of a better covenant, which has been legally enacted on better promises." So the fundamental point that the writer of Hebrews is making comes down to this issue. A priest must have something to offer in order to fulfill the office of the priesthood. There had to be some sort of an offering, because remember, the job of the priest is to go before God on behalf of the people. And so Jesus, as previously stated, was unqualified under the law to be a priest of the Levitical order. Since he was from the tribe of Judah, that immediately disqualified him from that position. But what the writer of Hebrews was telling us in the previous chapter is that Jesus is the high priest of a higher order, of a superior order. And this is really going to start to come into focus this evening as we begin to dig into chapter 8 and progress forward. But the earthly priests had to offer gifts and sacrifices first and foremost on their own behalf. So, essentially, if you want to think about it like this, every priest would have to essentially start the day by having to go and offer sacrifices for their own sins. And then they would start having to offer sacrifices for the sins of the rest of the people. And they would do that on Monday. And then they'd do that again on Tuesday. And they'd have to do it again on Wednesday. So forth and so on, over and over and over again. This was the regular habit. Jesus, however, back in the previous chapter, in chapter 7, verse 27, it says he doesn't need to offer sacrifices every day as high priests do, first for their own sins, then for those of the people. He did this once and for all when he offered himself. So, when Jesus went in, he offered a sacrifice one time. And he himself was that sacrifice. There is nothing that needed to be added to that offering that he already gave. There were no additional sacrifices that needed to be made. There were no additional offerings that needed to be made. Again, you go back into the law, you would have these sacrifices for sin, you would have cleansing sacrifices, you would have various gift offerings, you have all these many, many, many gifts and offerings that were supposed to be brought to the tabernacle and later the temple over and over again. Jesus did one. One gift, one sacrifice, one time. And then look again what he said in verse 1. We have this kind of high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. So again, that statement, sat down. It is important. It does not... It is not meant to be taken literally in terms that Jesus said, okay, I've kicked off for the rest of the day. I'm going to sit down in my lazy boy and watch the television. That's not the idea here. It means that the work is completed. That work has been finished. And if it's finished, there's no more work to be done. That's why he could sit down, because nothing else needed to be completed. It was one time only. There's nothing to add to it, nothing to complete it, nothing to finish it off, no additional sacrifices, nothing he forgot to do. He was done with making sacrifices and offerings. Then the writer of Hebrews says, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of majesty in heaven. Well, what is this idea? Why, when we hear the right hand, we understand that biblically what this means is this is the place of highest authority. This is supreme authority. So a person in ancient Israel or even in the ancient Near East, if you had a ruler, a king, they would appoint oftentimes something like a prime minister or a steward or something like that. So, for instance, Pharaoh with Joseph. Joseph was Pharaoh's right-hand man. There was no one in all of Egypt with any more authority than Joseph, with the exception of Pharaoh himself. So when you come across this statement about Jesus being at the right hand of the Father, it is talking about and referring to the fact that Jesus is in this place of supreme authority. And this is one of the things that the writer of Hebrews had talked about earlier in the book. From the very beginning, when he was talking about the position of Jesus, why Jesus is superior, he had touched on the authority of Jesus and how God was going, how the promise concerning the Messiah was that he was going to give him all of this authority. And so the idea being here is that Jesus has moved into that position. He has finished the work. He possesses all authority. And again, what is it that Jesus himself said when he gave the Great Commission? All authority is given unto me. That's how he starts. So the writer of Hebrews is saying Jesus is the supreme authority because he's at the right hand. The work of redemption is done because he sat down. A priest has to offer something in order to fulfill their job as a priest. They have to have something to offer. Well, Jesus' offering was a one-time only offering, and it's been completed. He is as we talked about last week, he is the supreme priest. He is the priest we need. He is greater than any of the priests in the Levitical priesthood. He is the greatest high priest ever to walk. He is not a priest after the Levitical priesthood. He is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, but he is a high priest. And this this leads us into what the writer of Hebrews starts to talk about concerning why the priesthood of Jesus is so much superior to the Levitical priesthood. Why the ministry of Jesus is superior to any earthly priest's ministry. And notice what he says. He says, if he were on earth, he wouldn't be a priest since there are those offering gifts prescribed by the law. In other words, again, this goes back to this thing that he's touched on several times. Jesus was not qualified to serve as a priest in the Levitical system. We already had that. That already existed, and it was insufficient. It was insufficient to meet the needs. But he says in verse 5, he gives us the explanation of the priesthood and of the entire Old Covenant, the entire Old Testament law. He says there in verse 5, these serve as a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. So, this is a very important thing to understand when we read in the Word of God. Everything that was built here on this earth in regards to the law, the tabernacle, all of the instruments that were used, the furniture that was used within the tabernacle, within the temple, and the garments that the priests wore, all of that, and even later the temple itself, was made as a replica of what God revealed first to Moses of what exists in heaven. Because there is a temple in heaven. There is a tabernacle in heaven. There is an altar in heaven. There is a lampstand in heaven. There's all of these things in heaven. What was made on this earth is a copy. When God gave the law, including the instructions, because he came right down, you go through the last half of the book of Exodus, and it's basically mostly instructions for how to build all of this stuff and where to put all of it. One of the things that God tells Moses is to follow the pattern that he had been shown. Well, what does he mean, the pattern? Does that mean that God came down and rolled out blueprints for him? No. He gave Moses insight. He gave him a vision that showed what exists in heaven. In fact, you go to the book of Revelation, we are told that John looked up at one point in time and he saw the Ark of the Covenant in heaven. That is not the earthly ark. That is the Ark of the Covenant that the earthly ark was patterned after. What was built here on earth, what was made here on earth, the entire Old Testament system, the entire Old Testament law, including the ceremonies and the structures and the physical things, including the priesthood itself, are designed to be a picture of what exists in heaven. And this becomes more and more important as we progress through. And it's going to become more important as we progress through the book of Hebrews to understand this. A while back in one of the question and answer sessions, there was a question that was asked, well, what did Jesus do during those 3 days between the crucifixion and the resurrection? He was engaged in his priestly duties. That's what he was doing. And this is going to be revealed as we progress through the book of Hebrews here. You're really going to begin to see this, but it starts with this fundamental point that what exists here on earth, what Moses was instructed to build and create, was to be a picture and a shadow of what exists in heaven. Jesus is a high priest, but he is not the high priest of an earthly temple. He is not the high priest of an earthly religious system. He is not the high priest of the Old Covenant. He is the high priest of the heavenly temple. He is the high priest of the original, if you will. He is the high priest of the new covenant. Which means, if he is high priest in heaven, and what was built here on earth is just a shadow, is just a copy, is just a picture of what exists in heaven, well then we can come to the realization that just as Melchizedek is a type of Christ, he is a picture of Christ, but he's not Christ. He is a shadow. He is an image. He is something to tell us about who Jesus is. That Jesus must be greater than Melchizedek. If the earthly temple and the earthly tabernacle and the earthly priesthood is just an image and a picture and a shadow of what exists in heaven so that we can have some level of idea and understanding, then what exists in heaven must be superior. Therefore, Christ must be superior. And if he is the high priest of the heavenly tabernacle and the heavenly temple, then the sacrifice that he made must be superior to any and all sacrifices ever made on this earth. And the covenant, because remember, one of the things that the writer of Hebrews told us is that if you have a new priesthood, you must have a new covenant. You're not going to introduce a new priesthood into the same system. The new priesthood must exist within a new system. Therefore, the new covenant has to be superior, because it's a heavenly covenant, to the old covenant. Because the old covenant was never meant to save. It was never meant to redeem. It was never meant to solve the spiritual problems. The old covenant was given to reveal the true priest, the true high priest, the true system, the true covenant. That's why I told you a couple weeks ago that when you go through and you start reading through the books of the law, and you start getting into that very, very dry and difficult stuff about this offering and that offering, you're thinking, what in the world does any of this have to do with me today? The answer is, it's a shadow of Christ. It is a picture of Jesus. It is a picture of the new covenant that is found in him, that he is the fulfillment of. When the Bible talks and tells us that Jesus came to fulfill the law, it means that quite literally. Because the law is incomplete. The law is perfect in what it says, but it's incomplete. We needed a new covenant. We needed a better covenant. We needed a better priest. We needed one that is eternal, not temporary. Because the old system was temporary. And by the way, let me just toss this out to you. If the old system was sufficient for forgiving sins, and the old system is what we were to abide by, do you realize that for 2,000 years, it would be impossible for anyone's sins to have been forgiven? Because the old system has been dead for 2,000 years. There hasn't been a sacrifice offered. There hasn't been a high priest for 2,000 years. The old system can't save us because the old system's gone. We need a new covenant. One that is not governed by earthly temporary things and weak men, but one that is perfect eternal, and holy. And that's the true dichotomy. That's the true picture. That's that true connection.